Ryan, it's great to be back at the Ransomware Summit. So both me and my colleague Angelo were volunteer analysts for the DFIR report. So today we're going to be discussing some of the key trends and developments in ransomware attacks over the last year. So just to know that ransomware attacks are still ongoing, despite improvements in detections and response and actions by law and enforcement. So there has been changes over the years. The threat actors have evolved their tradecraft. So that's what we're going to be looking at today. So we'll look at ransomware attacks in the last 12 months, so around the 2024 to the start of this year. So we're going to be looking more at the attacker tooling and how these have evolved over the time. And then we'll cover lateral movement, some of the trends and examples of different approaches we've observed and how these can be detected. Then the types of attacker tooling. So they use a mixture of living off the land, but we're seeing an increase of bespoke tooling. So we'll cover that in a bit of detail and why they've done that and methods of detection. And then finally, some hands-on keyboard activity by the threat actors. So what we see and what we can see over the wire. So just to note that the DFIR report develops and utilizes some incredible sources to track threat actor activity and provide some unique insights. So we can't go into specific detail about those because they're TLP red, but everything we're talking about in this talk is TLP clear. So it's been another busy year at the DFIR report. So we've observed continued ransomware activity using a variety of attack vectors, from exploiting public-facing vulnerabilities, delivering fake software by business email compromise as well. So threat actors are also adapting and leveraging a variety of different C2 frameworks. So it's not just Cobalt Strike, but other different ones, and then using a mix of living off the land techniques and self-built tools. We shared 11 public reports, so on average one report a month, and we created about 20 private reports, so these are limited distribution. We've collaborated with various partners, including the US CSIRT relating to cybersecurity advisory concerning the black suit threat actor. And we've observed about 30 different malware families, from initial access to ransomware encrypted. And we've also seen thousands of C2 servers being operated by various threat actors. Not to mention, we've contributed to a number of detections, so from Sigma rules to Yara-based detections. These are in our GitHub repo. I'm going to pass you over to my colleague Angelo, who's going to cover the trends that we've seen in the last 12 months.
Thanks, Pete, for handing the presentation over to me. I'm really pleased to participate in this amazing event. I'm going to provide you with an overview of the trends related to ransomware operations that we observed throughout 2024. The pie chart in the top left corner shows the prevalence of different ransomware families in our investigations. Lockbit was the most frequent one, as it represented 45% of the ransomware cases that ended up with the encryption process. Following that, in almost a fourth of the cases, we encountered Black Suite affiliates. The remaining 33% were related to other ransomware executable, like RansomHub. For every case that we analyze, we calculate the time to discover, which indicates when the threat actor first enumerated the compromised host or infrastructure. The time to hands-on, which is when the threat actor interacted with the malware to access the victim network. The time to lateral, which is the first time when the threat actor moved laterally into further systems. And the time to ransom, which measures the time between the initial access and the execution of the ransomware. The timeline on the right side shows that on average, ransomware affiliates discover the network almost around 17 hours after the initial access, and around 30 minutes later, they begin hands-on activities. However, it's worth to note that around 2/3 of the time, those two activities happened within the first hour of the intrusion. The first time a ransomware affiliate accesses another system besides the beachhead host is on average 1 day and 3 hours after the initial access. And around 5 days later, the ransomware executable is deployed in the infrastructure. The main initial access technique that we observed as precursors of ransomware attacks were drive-by compromise, exploiting public-facing applications, and the use of valid credentials. Instead, the most used C2 frameworks in 2024 were CobbleStrike, Metasploit, and Brook-Trotel. And the most frequently used offensive tools were tunneling softwares like SystemBC, Mimikatz for credential dumping, and PSXSec for lateral movement and ransomware execution. So during 2024, we assisted with two very important takedown operations performed by law enforcement. However, we would like to start this slide by also talking about what happened in 2023, because it impacted the ransomware operations carried out during the following year. Indeed, in August 2023, the FBI, along with various international partners, performed the takedown of the Quackbot infrastructure, which was heavily used by ransomware affiliates like Blackbasta. Then, in February 2024, an international coalition led by the NCA conducted the takedown of the Lockbit infrastructure, and just a couple of months later, so in May 2024, Europol carried out massive takedown operations of the main loaders that were used by ransomware affiliates to gain access to infrastructure. An example is ICE-ID. So we observed various effects from those law enforcement actions, which we summarized into 6 points. The first one is that Lockbit ransomware remained highly prevalent throughout 2024. This is potentially due to the wide distribution enabled by the leak of its builder code. In its threat landscape, we saw the emergence of new ransomware families like RansomHub and others. Operation Duck Hunt, which took place in 2023, successfully disrupted the distribution infrastructure associated with Quackbot. As a result, we observed a significant decrease in incidents initiated through this loader. Operation Endgame marked a decline in activities carried out via malware like ICE-ID or Bumblebee. Unfortunately, SystemBC remains a widely used tool in attackers' operation, primarily because it's not a first-stage loader, but rather a tunneling tool that assists attackers during post-exploitation activities. Finally, ransomware affiliates are increasingly relying on malware delivered through drive-by download, as we saw in the previous slide, or by exploiting exposed vulnerabilities which are accessible directly from the internet. Now, we would like to delve deeper into the initial access technique that we analyzed in 2024 cases. As you can see in the pie chart, the primary initial access technique that we observed was drive-by download, which accounted for around half of the incidents. This was followed in frequency by exploitation of public-facing applications. And additionally, in some cases, the threat actor had already obtained valid credentials, which were then used to gain access to the victim environment. So those are associated with the valid account technique. And then finally, around 12% of the cases were related to phishing attacks. So drive-by download is mainly associated with the use of CEO poisoning technique to deliver fake legitimate applications, which are then leveraged to install malwares on the victim machine. On this slide, we have two types of examples, SecTopRat and GoodLoader. In the first one, we see a modified version of the Zoom application, which has been tampered to execute a remote access Trojan. Another mimic tool that we frequently encounter is advanced IP scanner. Instead, in the second image, you can see bootloader, which lures the victims into downloading malicious files. Regarding vulnerable public-facing applications, the most prevalent one that was targeted was for sure Atlassian Confluence, particularly due to its remote code execution vulnerability, which was discovered in late 2023. As we saw in the first slide, the main C2 frameworks used by ransomware affiliates in 2024 were primarily CobaltStrike and Metasploit, which were employed in approximately the 44% and 38% of the cases. In others, we also observed the usage of BroodThreatel and Avoc. So CobaltStrike and Metasploit are well known for their frequent use by ransomware affiliates. CobaltStrike due to the public availability of cracked versions. We also wanted to highlight that in cases also not strictly tied to ransomware operations, we observed the use of alternative C2 frameworks like Pyramid, which is based on Python code. An interesting detail is that BroodThreatel was mainly used by Black Suite affiliates. In the image, you can see an example of BroodThreatel code embedded into a DLL, which was part of a CAD file. In this specific case, we were able to detect BroodThreatel through public YARA rule. Next, we would like to take a closer look at remote monitoring and management tools, as they are increasingly used by threat actors to facilitate their operations and evade security defenses. In the pie chart, you can clearly see that the most frequently used RRM tool was AnyDesk, which accounted for around 50% of the cases where an RRM tool was used by a ransomware affiliate. The second most common was Net Support Manager, followed by Atira, Mesh Agent, and DWS Remote Control in the remaining cases. Currently, AnyDesk is the preferred tool among ransomware affiliates when it comes to RRM solutions. And these tools are primarily used to achieve persistence, facilitate interactive operations, and evade security mechanisms. Since RRM tools are very commonly used by legitimate administrators within organizations. And as a result, they blend in very well into day-to-day operation and they go often unnoticed. Therefore, it is extremely important for organizations to clearly identify RRM tools which are legitimately used within their organizations and which ones should not be installed in the infrastructure. AnyDesk can be detected even also using public Sigma routes, which, for example, can trigger alerts based on specific command lines like install, start with win, silent, or reset passwords. These and other options are frequently observed when AnyDesk is being installed by threat actors. Additionally, RRM tools generate logs when they are used, and therefore these logs can then be leveraged by DFIR analysts to identify the actions performed by attackers on the compromised host. Finally, I would like to mention the amazing project called lolrmm.io, which provides a comprehensive list of RRM tools and the associated artifacts and detections. So I really suggest to check it out, that project. In the last slide of the trends overview, we would like to provide an analysis of the most frequently used tools by ransomware affiliates, excluding RRM tools and C2 frameworks. As shown in the bar chart on the left, the two main tools identified across our cases were, without any doubt, tunneling tools such as SysMBC and Mimikatz. Tunneling tools allow threat actors to redirect traffic from their command and control server through a compromised host into a target system. This enables attackers to execute various tools directly from their C2 infrastructure, primarily as a means of evading security defenses. Mimikatz is the preferred tool for credential dumping, which is commonly used to compromise additional accounts during the intrusion. Moreover, Mimikatz can be either run through executable or directly in memory via an established C2 framework. In terms of lateral movement, we observed that PSXEC is still widely used. It allows threat actors to move laterally across systems, and it is also often used to deploy ransomware at the end of an intrusion. When it comes to discovery and enumeration activities, Perfect Network Scanner is loved by ransomware affiliates. It helps threat actors to identify open ports and running services across the target infrastructure. Then, ranked fifth, we identified rclone, a popular tool for data exfiltration. It appeared in nearly a quarter of the incidents we analyzed. rclone enables fast exfiltration to cloud services and other remote storage platforms. And finally, AD-Find, which allows the enumeration of Active Directory environments by gathering detailed information about the directory object. In the image, you can see an example of SystemBC, which was being used to redirect RDP traffic, so port 3389. In this case, the threat actor was able to launch an RDP session directly from their C2 server and redirect the traffic to the target host. rclone is typically configured with credentials to access the destination server or storage services where the data is exfiltrated. And during forensic analysis, such credentials can be found. An example can be seen in the image where the clear text credentials used by the threat actor to log in into Mega were detected.
So Perfect Network Scanner used in the last couple of years, and last year it's frequently used by various threat actors. It's a legitimate activity or application, and it's used by system administrators, so it may not plug in antivirus scanners and may not be suspicious in the environment. And as mentioned, it provides a wealth of functionality from host discovery, access to remote services, such as shares, remote execution of commands. So you can understand why a threat actor likes to use this kind of tool. What's interesting to know, in one case, the threat actor brought in the tool into the environment as a portable application. And they brought in the license key because it's a paid for product. So they brought in a license key which enabled them to use all the functions. But there was also a configuration file. That configuration file contains all the saved settings of Perfect Network Scanner, and it's clearly been used in previous intrusions because we saw host configurations that weren't from that environment. They were from other IP addresses, host names that we didn't recognize. And it became apparent that these networks were actually, in fact, other targets associated to other victims. So we aren't disclosing the victim details, but we've listed countries and the types of sectors that they were targeted. Some of them are known and have been reported in the public domain, but others haven't. So this threat actor clearly likes using this tool and is bringing this into all the environments with their configuration. There are some methods of detection for tools like these. So looking for ping sweeps to multiple hosts, looking for SMB shares, enumeration. Those kind of detection would detect tools like these in the environment. So I mentioned earlier on that we've seen a lot of bespoke tools being developed and utilized. And they seem to be developed for very specific purposes. So a lot of the tools are designed to automate or aid the threat actor. It saves time, reduces a lot of the hands-on keyboard mistakes that we've seen over the years that cause errors or even crashes. So we've seen these as offset mistakes. So one tool that we saw that we call is Go Digger. This is a Microsoft Windows command line application. It's specifically geared towards collecting files within an environment that are of interest, sorting these files into categories, and then packaging them into zip files as collections ready for exfiltration. So the method of exfiltration was typically done by like rclone, which would then exfiltrate it out to an external hosted environment. Fundamentally, the tool relies on LDAP to determine the host on the network. So that does a lookup, and then for each host it knows about, it then enumerates each host to establish the shared folders. Then in each shared folder, it enumerates each folder in turn to scan for interesting file names and then collect them into files. And it provides summary reports on which data was collected, what hosts it's enumerating. So it's quite a useful tool for the threat actor. So when reverse engineering the application using Keynote, we can start to see some of the inner workings and functions. The first thing we notice is there's a hard coded list of keywords that are used to locate file names of interest, and only certain file types, typically documents, presentations. The keywords are English-based, so likely targeted against Western organizations. So it's a vast keyword list. It covers everything from security reports, financial details, organization plans like mergers and acquisitions, and even cyber insurance policies. There's no inspection of the actual file contents, so we're able to test the application with dummy files, just matching those keywords. Files are then staged into a folder location, and then once it's in that location where it's been copied, they're sorted into collections, and those collections then are named into zip files. As part of the zip file naming, they actually use a hard-coded company name, a real company name that we aren't disclosing. So we can only assume that they're using this name to provide some kind of legitimate sounding or looking files. There are a lot of other tools, functionalities built in as well that seem to be placeholders and don't provide any finished code. For example, we could see functions for exfiltration to various cloud-based services. So we could see notices saying it's not supported at the moment. There are other hard-coded strings for email addresses, such as evil hacker. So these appear to be like in development and placeholders. We could see references to Russian language use, so such as Pizek, which translates as a mess. That's a polite definition of it. Interestingly, we saw Evil Corp being referenced, seemed to be used as part of a check, but wasn't triggered by any of the functions that we could see. So Evil Corp reference is very interesting, as it's referred to as a Russia-based cybercrime group, possibly indicating links between the developer or code reuse between groups. Again, several methods of detection around LDAP searches for unusual processes, SMB discovery and exfiltration via tools such as rclone. The next bespoke tool that we observed the threat actor using was a small .NET application designed to enumerate hosts in a compromised network. We call this called scorecard, as its key function is to gather host information, such as whether the host is online, offline, the disk space, including MAC drives and installed programs. The tool is GUI-based, and it can take a list of IPs, then save the results to text files in the same folder as the application. Then this can be used by the threat actor to decide whether to target those particular hosts or avoid them if they've got AVs installed and so on. Some of the key functions, it uses WMI for remote discovery, and it can impersonate a user, providing a username and password. Interesting quirk, there's a bug with a progress bar where the value goes beyond 100%. It can crash the application. Going into a bit more detail on reverse engineering the application using a DNI.NET Spy, there are several WMI commands that were invoked, from collecting detailed and mock drive, all the way through looking who was a logged in user. WMI was used to access the host registry remotely to retrieve a list of installed programs. And then there was a hard-coded list where it was checked against keywords to flag against AV products, book recovery storage tools, and if virtualization products were used. A simple tool that could provide the threat actor with a very good situational awareness of the environment, host to avoid, and identify host that could provide core functions such as backup recovery, which could be a very useful target. So moving on from custom tools to hands-on activities using .NET type tools. So wireless tools can be more difficult to detect. These tools don't get written to the disk or executed as a standalone process. So instead, these tools are loaded into an implant, such as a Cobalt Strike beacon as an assembly. So some of these assemblies only conduct read-only activities, so they have very limited interaction with the host in terms of writing or executing things. So EDRs typically don't log that type of activity because there's loads of read-only activity, so it would just be too noisy, unless it's high fidelity and low noise, like against like credential store. So several common tools that we observed by threat actors are seatbelt, sharp shares, and sharp view. So seatbelt provides very detailed information of a host, from operating system build, processor configuration, network, everything. So it provides a good picture for the threat actor. Then sharp shares provides enumeration of the network shares, and then sharp view is a .NET implementation of Power View, another enumeration type tool. But using event tracing for Windows, there's a loader ETW that can log events under event ID 153 that does capture some interesting indicators of tool use. So, for example, here you can see one DLL32 has loaded sharp shares. So we know this is a beacon running in memory via one DLL32. It shows the PDP path, which is a programmer's database, which is an artifact from compilation of binaries. And you can see the correlation to the original GitHub repo, and like the folder paths shared a very similar name. There are other methods of detection as well. You've got the module path, which is sharp shares. So when .NET assemblies are loaded, a common language runtime log is created. So typically you'd expect to see .NET applications feature. Occasionally you might see unmanaged ones. So like here you can see one DLL32.exe.log being created as a result of this .NET assembly being loaded into it. It's not high fidelity. There are looks positive, but it's a useful way of confirming suspicions if you haven't got these kind of logs. Then finally, we often see our outputs being generated directly on the disk. So these are files. So when they run sharp shares, they would dump the output to shares.txt. And the same with seatbelt info, they call it like seatinfo.txt, and then they pull these files out. So, as Angelo mentioned, we see a lot of C2 frameworks. Cobalt Strike is still a popular choice. So, where available from process dump files, we try to extract the config of the beacon. We try to use like script from DigiStevens 1768 Python script, and that can give you a bit of useful insight into the configuration of that beacon, such as the calling domains, any IOCs. So what have we seen from this kind of analysis? There are some fingerprints. So Cobalt Strike beacons, they have watermarks. We can correlate certain watermarks against particular threat actors. Some of these are pirated, cracked, others are specific license identifiers. So in the case of Black Suit, we could correlate the malware to a licensed version of Cobalt Strike Team Server by its process stub identifier. So decoding that to the MD5, we can find a matching jar file, which is a Java archive file, which is what the CobbleStrike team server is based on, is Java. Then from there, we can determine a SHA-256 hash. And then using the CobbleStrike verify page, we can put that SHA-256 hash in, and we can see it's CobbleStrike 4.4. So it's quite old. The current version is 4.11. I think there's a newer version just been released in the last week or so. But Blacksuit are still able to use a tooling, and it's still serving a purpose for all it needs for. So they don't need all the latest bells and whistles in the newer versions. Continue with CobbleStrike, but looking at the C2 operate activity, what actually happens over the wire. So under the right circumstances, it's possible to inspect C2 traffic between the beacon and the team server at the network layer. So for this to happen, the traffic needs to be unencrypted without any TLS and using HTTP port 80, for example. Secondly, the version of CobbleStrike being used must have a configuration where the private key is known, i.e. leaked. So this could be from CobbleStrike configuration, but it's been pirated or cracked, or it's been shared in the community somewhere, and they're reusing the same config. So we were able to decrypt the C2 network traffic, again, using a script from Didier Stevens, for one case we reported on, where the threat actor had these precisely right circumstances for us to do that. And we could see operator commands being created, and the results being transmitted back from the beacon to the team server. So we observed a few interesting things from a threat actor point of view that we don't normally see in collected telemetry, such as EDR. For example, we could see the threat actor adjust the sleep value. So sleep is used to provide a delay or jitter in the C2 activity. So it's primarily to blend in HTTP traffic and not to be too noisy, i.e. preventing like a continuous stream of HTTP requests. We also saw the threat actor browse and navigate folders and list file contents. We could also see additional beacons being dropped onto the endpoint and then executed. So this was done through that channel. So this appeared to be an additional implant. So threat actors tend to have like a backup C2 channel into a compromised environment. So they might have a short haul and long haul type beacons. So if one beacon does get blocked by an AV, they've got a fallback mechanism, they can drop another one in. And then we also saw the checks for making sure files were deleted, then doing file directory listing. So clearly there is some OPSEC being followed. So this slide shows some offset mistakes made by attackers when using C2 implants. So a fairly common observable is a mismatch between HTTP user agent strings. So these are normally configured for the implant based on a profile. So the example here shows a user agent corresponding to the Apple Mac, but the actual endpoint was Microsoft Windows operating system. So if you've got that kind of environment where you've got no Macs, this would be a good way of detecting that kind of activity. Again, a slight variation. The Windows build number was using NT 6.1 as reference, so that corresponds to Windows 7. So if you haven't got Windows 7 on your environment, again, that would be very unusual and warrant further investigation. So looking for user agent strings can be quite powerful. So some other strong indicators is continuous and excessive HTTP traffic. So I mentioned about the sleep configuration. Sometimes this is set to full interactive, resulting in tens of thousands of requests per hour. So I briefly mentioned CobbleStrike watermarks. So these are the types of identifiers we've seen that have been known to be used by threat actors. Moving on to identity-related telemetry, regardless of a tool being used, at some point, user accounts will be accessed. These could be compromised accounts or accounts they created backdoors to facilitate persistence. So from cases observed last year, we saw accounts being created. Some of these were designed to blend in, others less so. So a threat actor created an account called No Name. Others were a bit more subtle, like SQL backup. So there are ways of detecting that via Windows audit logs. You can also look for unusual account creations not conforming to standard naming conventions, excessive privileges being assigned, accounts being created out of hours, so on. For example, the SQL backup account was created when the threat actor exploited a vulnerability. So they achieved system shell and then they created the account, which could be quite unusual because if you know that account are managed by a local administrator and then you start seeing a system account creating it, that could be very suspicious. Other unusual account interactions is account enumeration from system and service accounts. Finally, one consistent trend we see is the use of RDP connections. So we see generic user accounts using RDP to connect to like domain controllers and other sensitive hosts. Understanding what accounts should be using RDP, baselining RDP usage via Windows audit logs could help to identify suspicious activity. Is RDP being used out of hours? Is it being used by someone in the accounts department, which wouldn't expect to use RDP? So continue with identity. Monitoring desktop workstation names can help identify unusual activity. So the last few years, and Angelo mentioned about increase of tunnels from System BC, Cloudflare, SOCs, and so on. So threat actors tends to leverage these via attack boxes. So they directly access resources within a compromised environment using a tunnel, which tends to go through like a proxy beacon. So this quite often leaks their own attack box machine name. So the machine name then appears in Windows logon events corresponding to the username that they use. So the example here, we see the attacker leverage a backdoor account that they logged in from their attack box. So here's a few identifiers that we observed in the last year. For example, Kali is a well-known pen test Linux distribution. Others appear to be auto-generated names provided by Windows. So similar to account names, if your environment uses specific naming convention for hosts, this could be easily detected. Secondly, correlating usernames to machine names at a baseline to detect unusual activity. So what do we recommend you do? At a minimum, configure audit login and monitor previous account access. If you can't see that and you don't understand it, then it's going to be a real challenge to understand, detecting from what's normal and what's abnormal. Try to baseline our activity, pay attention to admin accounts, unusual activity from system accounts and any RDP. If this is a challenge, configure honey tokens, accounts or files that a user or endpoint shouldn't access, then alert against that. Antivirus, monitor for health of the endpoints, any indicators of tampering activity with these things like Defender control being used to trying to switch off, disable AV. Endpoints not checking in. So yeah, look out for that. Because if you don't understand how your AV is working, then it's going to be really challenged to detect that. And we always see a lot of the AVs being tripped. So monitor AV alerts. In virtually every case, there's always something what the attacker has done, like dropped a tool, accessed a file, executed a command that has triggered something. Testing. So understand and validate controls, what is prevented and what needs detecting, and then understand your environment. If any attacker can put the time and effort to understand your environment, we've seen the tools that they're bringing in where they're mapping the environment. You should do the same. Know your weakness. Have you got things that are overexposed? Understand your weaknesses in preventative controls. Fix those. Identify if you how to detect those if you can't prevent it. So we've seen attackers achieve their objectives in under an hour and sometimes persist on the network for weeks. What do you have exposed to the internet? Any RDP collaboration tools? We've seen Elastin being compromise, and that's been the way into the network. Store sensitive files in a secure location and restrict access to need to know. So start segmenting and managing your shares. We've seen attackers interested in user detailed insurance policies. Do you really need to have that on a share that everyone can see? And detect early, understand the MITRE-ATT&CK framework. Don't focus too much on the ransomware encryptor. It's too late to respond by them. Start focusing earlier on in the kill chain. Prepare for an incident. There are numerous training resources from SANS to national advisories and best practices from UK NCSC, CSIRT, and there's a brief later on today talking about tabletop exercises. So understand the process procedures and what you need to do in the event of an incident like this. Lastly, a big thanks to the DFIR Report crew for publishing, sharing insights into the intrusions we've mentioned in this presentation, and not to mention the Ransomware Summit organisers for putting on such a great event.